Psalm 14 is maybe one of the most profound statements that God has ever left mankind with. And he starts off with a pretty hard word. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Because of this, they are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, any who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good. Not even one. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers, who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, but let Israel be glad. Psalm 15 turns, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent, and who shall dwell on your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right, and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue, and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who swears to his own hurt and does not change, who does not put out his money at interest and does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. Psalm 16 reads, Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. We see David start off in Psalm 14 by rebuking unbelieving people who claim that they know there is no God. And he exposes the foolishness of atheism. And then he goes on to explain that truly all that those who say there is no God are doing is clinging to their desire to remain in their sin and their evil. And what David is pointing to then as he gets to Psalm 15 is that there are righteous people, and those righteous people are righteous not on their own account, but because God has declared them righteous. And David goes on to say that the righteous should be not honored per se, but should be recognized because they have maintained that good standing before God. And then in the next psalm, David continues to wax on about the righteous, and he says that the righteous are only righteous because God holds them and keeps them and does not abandon them, and that their hope and their trust is not in anything that they have done, but what God has done for them on their part. That is the message of salvation. There are many people today who would compare themselves to others and say, compared to a murderer or a child molester or a rapist, I'm basically a pretty good guy. And even within the confines of social judgment, criminals themselves will also compare themselves to other criminals, and they have a standard where as long as they're not as bad as the guy next to them, they're pretty much okay. See, that's all of humanity. That's what we do all day long, all the time. We're always determining and judging our own righteousness and our own goodness based on other people's lack of righteousness and evil deeds. So and it's very easy in this part of Minnesota to throw a rock and hit somebody who works at the Mayo Clinic. In fact, it's pretty hard to throw a rock and not hit somebody that works at the Mayo Clinic or is in some way affiliated with the Mayo Clinic. However, guess what? There are criminals that work at the Mayo Clinic. And I don't just mean because they work at the clinic. But when people hear, oh, you work at Mayo, or oh, you're a doctor, or oh, you're an administrator, there's this sense of awe. Like, oh, wow, you must be really important. You must be a really decent person in the eyes of society and culture. And we do it with school teachers. You know, school. Oh, you're a school teacher, and I really respect it. And I do. I respect. I have a very, very good friend that teaches school. Several friends actually that teach in government schools. I have a lot of respect for them. And it used to be that when you would meet somebody in law enforcement, you would assume the best of them. Now, instead, what happens is you meet somebody in law enforcement, and you assume they're a criminal. But there was a day when you would meet somebody in law enforcement and you'd have a lot of respect for that person. And so what we do, especially in modern American culture, is we make our judgment, or we ascertain whether or not a person is good kind of based on what they do for a living. And see, that's fostered because, you know, doctors like to be thought well of, and lawyers, well, I don't know why lawyers like to be thought well of.
Me neither.
But doctors like to be thought well of, and lawyers and politicians like to be thought well of, and it's basically we like to think well of ourselves. And then you meet the guy who's, you know, working at the county fair, scooping out after everybody leaves, got to clean all that area out, and you think, oh, wonder what he did to get that job. Or you meet the guy who collects trash so that you don't have to get rid of your own trash, and you think to yourself, Christians.
Yes, sir.
You think to yourself, I must be a pretty good person compared to that guy, but I got news for you. In the eyes of God, no one is good, and it doesn't matter what kind of work you do. God doesn't go, oh, you're a lawyer, you're all right. Oh, you're a doctor, you're all right.
Hey, stop it, go.
Oh, you work at this, you do this, you must be all right. God looks down and he says in several places that every intention of the heart of man is only evil always. If you are a human being and you have not come to Jesus Christ for salvation and come to Christ alone, God says you are wicked. And that's why you need Christ. Your religious tradition doesn't matter. Your church attendance doesn't matter. Where you work doesn't matter. I don't care if you're a heart surgeon and you've saved 45 people in the last 3 days. If you don't know Christ, all those people that you saved on the operating table in that operating room aren't going to mount to a hill of beans. Because God doesn't measure you against everyone around you. He measures you up against His Son, the perfect example of righteousness. And then He measures you also against His law. And the reason that I say He measures you against those two things is because Christ is the means by which the law was kept perfectly on the part of people who will believe. So the biggest muckety-muck supervisor, administrator type at Mayo or at a public school or the sheriff of the local sheriff's office or whoever it might be, it doesn't matter what their career is. It doesn't matter what their position is. What matters is whether or not they have come to know salvation through the God-man, Jesus Christ. We have to have Christ to have salvation. There is no hope of salvation apart from that. And so we have to get out of this mindset where we are constantly comparing ourselves to everyone else to determine whether or not we're good. Has it ever struck anybody that every single time some kid goes into a school and shoots it up, for the most part everybody said, I'm really surprised. He was always so quiet and he was really nice. I mean, that started to change a little bit. But you hear it over and over and over again. I'm really surprised. I can't believe this kid did that. Every time somebody does something atrocious, everybody goes, man, that floors me. That guy was so nice. And then he went out and did this horrible act. It's like I guarantee you, when Hitler was growing up and when he was little Adolf on his mother's knee, nobody was going, yep, this is going to be the guy. Nobody was saying that. When Pol Pot was a little kid, nobody said, oh, yep, he's gonna slaughter millions in Cambodia. Same thing with Idi Amin. When Idi Amin was a little kid and he was growing up, nobody said, oh, yep, Idi's going to be a massacre guy. It's always, man, I'm really surprised. And here's why we're surprised when people do those things, because we think we're basically good. We think we have good hearts. And we don't. We don't have good hearts. We're selfish and we're self-centered and we only care about what we want and when we want it, and we want it now. That's coveting. There's two commandments that bookend the 10 commandments. One is thou shalt not covet. And the other is you shall have no other gods before you. And so what happens when we take our eyes off of God and we start to look down at ourselves and we start to cherish our own wants and our own desires, and then we look at our neighbors and we see that our neighbors have things that we want, and then we start to covet those things, and then we start to come up with ways to get those things that we don't have a right to have. And that's what leads to stealing, and that's what leads to adultery, and that's what leads to murder. It's because we fail to keep God in our sight, and we fail to love our neighbors the way we love ourselves. I mean, how many of you have heard about the guy who wins the multi-million-dollar lottery and you say to yourself, man, I wish I had what he had? Why? I mean, statistically, most of these people who win these mega lotteries end up broke in 5 to 10 years anyway, because they don't know how to live with it, and they go out and buy everything they shouldn't buy, and they blow it, and they end up broke and destitute. I don't know how you do that when you win $35 million, but it happens. It's the same thing that drives us to think that we have to always be competing with everyone else. We deserve what they have, so we're going to go get it. It's just, honestly, criminals are just more honest than we are. I know that sounds funny, but criminals are just more honest than your average person on the street. Because a criminal will step up, raise up his hand and say, yeah, if I want what you got in your house, I'm coming in to get it. That's why every time they pass a new gun law, the only people giving up their guns are law-abiding citizens, not criminals. Criminals are honest. We're just scared. And so when I say that criminals are honest, I'm not saying that they tell the truth all the time, but they admit it. They're criminals, and they're going to get what they want. And that's how we are. That's the heart of every human being. From the age of 0 to the day they die, the human heart is evil and wicked, and unless you have been saved and washed in the blood of Jesus Christ, your heart's going to stay that way until you die. As I've said this already, baptism doesn't save you. Scriptures even say that. Baptism doesn't save. Good works won't save you. Confirmation doesn't save you. Catechism doesn't save you. First Communion doesn't save you. These are things that we do because we think we have to, but as most of you have probably heard, if you stand in a garage all day long, you're not going to be a car. And every religion has this mentality. There are people within Judaism who think that they're going to heaven because they're Jews and they've kept God's law. There are people in Islam who believe because they say their prayers 5 times a day and they've done all 5 pillars, they've declared their Hajj, they've gone on their pilgrimage, that somehow they've earned Allah's favor. But you can't be saved by works. Being a good Jew, being a good Christian, being a good Muslim is not what saves. Assalamu alaikum. Are you guys having a good day? Yeah? Can I give you something? Again, assalamu alaikum. Ladies. Sunni or Shia? Sunni? Where are you from? Saudi? Are you just visiting or are you living? And I'm not saying that being religious is bad. There again, I've quoted today several times from the book of James. James says that this is good and pure religion, that you visit widows and orphans and you keep the law of God. That's pure religion. That's what James has said in his word. So when you meet somebody who says, well, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious, what they're really saying is they don't want to visit widows and orphans and they don't want to keep the law of God. They just want to have their own standard. But here's the deal. God doesn't judge us based on our standards. He judges us based on His standards. And His standards are impossible for us to keep. And I know that sounds like, well, that's not fair. I mean, like, And how many of you have kids and you have pretty impossible standards for your kids? Like, my parents were pretty fair, but Mom would give me a curfew and I'd walk in the door like 12:01 and I'd be in trouble. I was also notorious for my mom giving me a task and I wouldn't remember to do it, and then I'd have to sit until I remember what it was, and that never worked for me. But parents just don't give really fair standards. And so the issue isn't whether or not God is fair. We don't want God to be fair. If God were fair, He'd give everybody the same thing all the time, and everything that we deserve at all times from God is only judgment and justice. And we don't want God's justice. We want His mercy. We want His grace. And that's what I would point you to. Don't ever look at God and say, give me what's fair. Say, Lord, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. Jesus, as He's ministering on the earth with His disciples, Jesus is confronted often by the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, well, they were all right. I mean, there were things that they could have done a lot better. They misled a lot of people. But for the most part, the Pharisees weren't, in the eyes of culture, they weren't bad guys. They were literally doing what they thought they needed to do to honor God and please Him. And so, one day Jesus tells a parable, and a parable is nothing more than a story that has a point. Jesus tells this parable, and in this parable He talks about a Pharisee and a publican. And a publican was kind of the worst of sinners, because a publican would have been a Jewish person who had bought the right to collect taxes from his fellow Jews. And so Jewish people hated publicans more than they hated the Romans, because they saw them as betrayers. How you doing, man?
Not too bad. How about you?
Still having a great day.
Yeah.
Can I give you something to take with you and read?
Sure.
I promise. It's not going to like explode on you or anything.
Okay.
There you go.
You.
Check it out when you have time. Especially if you're a thinker, you'll like that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Is your name Tom?
Todd. Yeah, Todd. Tom's the guy who wrote it. My card's on the inside, so let me know what you think when you read it.
Sounds good.
So the Pharisees especially hated the publicans, and so here's this publican in the temple praying, and here's the Pharisee in the temple praying, and the Pharisee's looking at the publican as he's praying. He says, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like this guy over here. Sounds like us, right? We say, oh, I'm glad I'm not a murderer. I'm glad I'm not a bank robber. I'm glad I'm not this really bad dude or gal. I'm glad I'm not a child molester or a rapist, right? And so here's what happens. The Pharisees praying all this. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like this person, and I do all these things. I tithe on my tithe. I tithe on the spices in my cabinet. I think about, he tithes on even his garlic and his pepper and his salt. And tithe is in offering. He takes a tenth of it and gives it to God. And he's talking about all these wonderful things that he does. And then the publican in the temple can't even look up. The Pharisees looking up to heaven at God all the time. The publican won't look up. The sinner won't look up. The tax collector won't look up. He looks down at the ground the whole time because he cannot raise his eyes to heaven. And he says, Lord, I'm worthless. I have no value. I am wicked. I'm rotten. And what I'm going to say is that we are more like the Pharisee who stands before God and declares how good He is and how wonderful He is. And we are nothing like the publican. Because right now somebody's hearing this and saying, how dare he say that I am not a good person? And I got news for you. If your response is how dare you say I'm not a good person? Look me up.
Huh?
Look me up.
Okay.
Have a good day. Ride safe, okay, man?
Yeah, you too.
If your response is, how dare you say I'm not a good person, but then you point to your church going, and you point to all these other things that you've done in a religious tradition, you do not understand the God of Christianity. The only thing that sets you apart from other people in that sense is You've been washed in religious tradition. And so many people have had that. So what the Reformation was all about. I mean, like I said when I started here a little bit ago, you can't hardly throw a rock and not hit somebody that works at Mayo Clinic. You can't hardly throw a rock and not hit somebody that isn't a Baptist or a, well, they're harder to hit around here. But Lutherans, Missouri Synod, ELCA, Association of American Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, there are tons of people who are all from the Protestant Reformation. That's the whole reason the Reformation happened, was to break away from irreligious religious traditions that had no basis in Christianity. And here we are today. We need another Reformation because those same people who would claim to be evangelical Christians, who would claim to be Protestant Christians, have no concept of who God is, have no concept of what the gospel is. They have no concept of what Jesus Christ did to make salvation a reality. You need Christ. Because without Christ, there is no hope. There is no salvation apart from the Son of God. I'll point to the people in this area that everybody looks at and says, man, they're really nailing it. The Amish. In the Amish community, if you're not Amish, you aren't going to heaven. And you don't get just to be Amish. You have to be born Amish. And if you do one thing and you abandon the Amish faith, you're done. The Amish look down their noses at us because we aren't nailing it the way they do. What's that sound like? And that's the heart of every single person. We're trusting in something. We're trusting in something other than God if we think we're good people and we deserve to be saved, because we don't. We don't deserve what Christ did on the cross. You have to understand that. You don't deserve it. I hear Christians all the time talk about how wonderful the songs at their church are, because what they learn when they're singing is how much they deserve Jesus' death on the cross. Jesus did that because I was so awesome. I've actually had people say that to me. Jesus died on the cross because I'm so awesome. Are you kidding me? If you were awesome, Jesus didn't need to die on the cross. Jesus didn't die on a cross because you're awesome. Jesus died on a cross because you're worthless. I know that's harsh, but that's what the scriptures say. The cross isn't about how precious you are. The cross isn't about how wonderful you are. The cross is about how wicked you are and how wonderful God is. The cross is about how amazing God is. There's two things happen at the cross. We talk about the love of God all the time, and He is a God of love. He's a God of justice, and He's also a God of wrath. And so what happens at the cross is all these attributes of God meet on the cross in the person of Jesus Christ. With Jesus on the cross, and the wrath of God, and the love of God, and the mercy of God, and the grace of God, and the justice of God, and the omnipotence of God all meet on the cross. That's what the cross was about. And Jesus says, "Look to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth." Everybody, everywhere, look. There's no nationality, there's no ethnicity, there's no geopolitical way to be saved. There's no group of people who are going to be saved just for being that particular group of people. The Jews are no more special than the Gentiles. Men are no more special than women when it comes to salvation. And vice versa. Jesus Christ died on the cross not because of how precious we are and how wonderful we are. Jesus Christ died on the cross because we deserve hell, and he took it for us. He took our hell. Before Jesus was betrayed by Judas in the garden, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. And while he's in the garden praying, he prays 3 times. Father, if it would be your will, let this cup pass from me. Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. He says it again, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. But the 3rd time that he says it, he says, but Father, not my will, but yours. So what was in the cup? What was in the cup that Jesus was asking to have passed from him? It was the wrath of God. Every time, for the most part, that you open up the Old Testament and you hear about God pouring out his cup, he's pouring out his cup of wrath. He refers to it as a foaming poison. Jesus was praying that the foaming poison of the wrath of God would pass from him because he knew what he was about to endure. Because he was 100% God, and in the flesh he was 100% man, and he knew there was no way as a human being he was going to endure that wrath. And he was about to take that. And that's why he said, let this cup pass from me. What Jesus took on the cross was the wrath of God because he loved humanity. That was the amazing thing about the cross. The love of God meets with the justice and the wrath of God at the cross. And then he says, now look to me and be saved. That's the amazing love of God. It's the amazing grace of God. It's a beautiful message. And it's for anybody who will hear it and believe. How are you, sir? Something tells me you're trying to make a point. This frustrating you? You know Christ, Lord? As Lord, sir?
You're welcome to free speech, but not with a microphone.
That's actually untrue, sir.
Well, then this is my free speech.
I'm not saying it isn't. I just asked, is this bothering you?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because you're making a racket.
No, I'm preaching the gospel, sir. I'm preaching the gospel, and
You're so full of shit.
you don't like it.
No, I know the gospel.
No, you don't. If you knew the gospel, you wouldn't be trying to interfere with it.
Yeah, that's all right.
So what's the gospel, sir?
Carry on.
What's the gospel?
I'm not interested in you.
You're not interested in the gospel?
I'm not interested in you.
No, you're not interested in the gospel. You don't know Christ, sir. Because if you knew Christ and you loved the gospel, you wouldn't be upset. You wouldn't be upset. You're denying God before men right now. And I think you're trusting in your religious tradition, sir. And I think as you trust in your religious tradition, you think you're doing a good thing. You think right now God's approving of you or opposing me. But it's sad. I don't want that for you. You should be rejoicing at the public proclamation of the gospel. This is how Christ did it. This is how the apostles did it. The church fathers did this. This is the way the church has preached the gospel for years, sir, for centuries. And only those that oppose it are those that hate it. And I'll give you credit. You've got moxie, more than a lot of people do, but it still comes down to the reality that you're only opposing because you hate the message of the gospel. James says to people who say, oh, I know the Lord, or I believe God is one, he says, that's good that you believe that, but the demons believe that and they tremble at his name. And sir, I don't want that for you. But I see the light has come into the world and you hate the light. And that's why you're upset. You hate the light and that's why you're upset. But you sit there, sir, and you tell me that you love God and that you know the gospel. If you love God and you knew the gospel, you'd be praying for me right now instead of trying to distract me with Beatles music. Music, by the way, written by people, and it's super talented for the most part. Their later stuff, not as much. Yellow Submarine was horrible. But for the most part, especially John Lennon, was an atheist who despised God and said he would be happy if there were no religion and that Christians would cease to exist. And that's the music you chose to play to try and be a distraction? Sir, that breaks my heart. So I'm going to call on you, sir, to repent and believe the gospel. You say you know it. Have you ever recognized how sinful you are? Have you ever recognized how rotten and corrupted the human heart is? And that's mine too, before Christ and without him. So I'm pleading with you. Don't trust in your religious tradition. Don't be the person that James was talking to when James said, sure, you say you believe, but do you tremble at his name or do you bow before him? That's what I want.
I'm sorry to call this number. I'd like to call my county sheriff.
Oh, this is good. Now he's going to use law enforcement. I love this.
I'm calling from Lanesboro.
Yeah.
There's a
See, this is how God-hating people, respond to the preaching of the gospel. They call law enforcement and ask law enforcement to come. If you're a Christian and your response to the preaching of the gospel is to call law enforcement, you do not know Christ.
downtown Lanesboro.
Yep.
Right behind me.
I'll be here. I'll be waiting for him.
Violating it. No, he's just violating the noise
No.
microphone.
Yeah. Well, sir, you don't. No, sir, you don't. No, sir, you don't. That's the coward's way out. You can't argue the point. You know philosophically you're wrong. You claim to be a Christian and you call law enforcement.
Exactly. So I'll do it again too.
Sir, I've talked to them hundreds of times. Sir, repent and turn to Christ, sir. No, it's not. He has every right to walk away. That's the practice of a God-hating man, sir. You should be responding in joy to the preaching of the gospel. I'll say again, if your response to the preaching of the gospel is to get angry and call law enforcement, you do not know Christ. You have a good day, sir. I'm going to be praying that you turn to Christ for everlasting life. Turn to Christ and live, sir.